なんでそんなに優しいの？私を騙してるわけじゃないよね。もしそうならずっと騙しててほしいのね。
Hey everyone, this is Nitro. So, in this video, I am going to be covering the way to build Chris, who is the cleric pilgrim who turned into a chance encounter with Ledin, turned into Queen of Baldia, turned into Langrisser mobile waifu, who confesses to you. After all, who needs their husband when they can have a new romance? On a more serious note though, Chris is a great character for PvE if you play Legion of Glory. She's also reasonably useful for doing Eternal Temple. However, for that fight, she does need one key piece of equipment, which I'll go over once I reach the gears section. So, let's begin talking about Chris. And the required characters for her bonds is her fourth bond requires Lance, who you start with at the start of the game. So her fourth bond is guaranteed to be unlocked, right? Because everyone starts with Lance. As for her fifth bond, the attack and int bond, that is unlocked by having Ledin. So, realistically speaking, you're not going to use Chris if you don't have Ledin as your tank anyways, so it works out perfectly in that sense. In terms of her talent, which is Gift, it has two effects. The first part of the talent is that the damage dealt increases by a certain percentage. And the percentage is 10% at 2 stars, then 12% at 3 stars, 14% at 4 stars, 17% at 5 stars, and then 20% at 6 stars. So a decent amount of damage increase, which also affects her soldiers. As for the second part of her talent, its effect is that after taking action, it dispels one debuff from a certain number of allies within a certain number of blocks, not including this unit, and it also adds one random buff to them. In terms of the number of friendly units getting debuffs removed, it goes from 1 at 2 stars to 2 at 3 stars and 4 stars. It becomes 3 at 5 stars and 4 friendly allies at 6 stars. Finally, with regards to the allies within a number of blocks, at 2 stars and 3 stars, it's only 1 block. But then at 4 stars, 5 stars, and 6 stars, it does become 2 blocks. Ultimately, this talent just means that in order to truly use Chris, she really should be at 6 stars, because that way at 6 stars she can dispel and add buffs to 4 allies, right? And also she will do 20% additional damage. At 5 stars, with it dispelling debuffs from 3 allies and adding buffs onto them, that's acceptable, but really at 4 stars it's really iffy to use her. So because she is an SR, and with every 10 summon giving you a guaranteed SR hero, it can be very random on whether you get any Chris shards or not. You can see for me, my Chris is at 4 stars, right? And I have a lot of other SR heroes at 6 stars. So in that sense, it can be pretty hard to choose to build Chris unless you have her at like 5 stars really early on. Because you're definitely not going to farm shards of her. At least that's my opinion. So, with that said, let's now talk about her best class. And Chris's best class in general, this is actually a very interesting choice, because Valkyrie has 1 range and 3 movement, whereas Princess has 3 movement and 2 range. However, all her best skills do come from her Saintess to Valkyrie class. That's where you get her Faith skill, allowing her to heal, allowing her to increase damage dealt and heal after battle. And then Redemption allows her to attack a single target for 1.5 times damage and heal all allies, excluding the caster, for 2 times caster's intelligence. Melee soldiers also attack. So you pretty much must go into Saintess and Valkyrie, right? Bishop and Princess add, I guess, additional support skills, specifically Dispel and Mass Attack. And it also adds a good amount of stats, 25 int, 90 hit points, 10 magic defense for mastering Princess, and Bishop gives 48 hit points and 8 magic defense. So getting the second class mastery on her is a nice to have for sure, but not really required. As you can see, my Chris doesn't have that second class mastery yet. And the other thing about these two classes though is, as I mentioned, the 1 range versus 2 range, but also Valkyrie can actually equip light armor, which is the armor for archers, assassins, and flyers. So it makes the choice very hard between Valkyrie or Princess for her final class. Stats wise, let me just bring that up quickly. Stats wise, it's also quite interesting. You can see here, her Valkyrie class has a huge amount of hit points, 3782, which is very, very high, right? Lana in her Hermit class has less hit points than that. And Lana has incredible survivability as a healer. So that hit point difference is a very tough choice to choose between. Especially since, if you go into Valkyrie, you have basically a ranged attacker who has hit points comparable to Lana, making her very hard to kill. If you go into Princess, you have hit points very comparable to Lana, and Lana is basically a glass cannon. Also, Valkyrie class Chris has more intelligence than the Princess class Chris. So which one you choose is ultimately kind of up to you. If you're doing PvE content, I would say you definitely want to use the Valkyrie class. And then if you're doing PvP content, that's when you may consider doing the Princess class Chris. But keep in mind, you lose the ability to equip all of those Archer, Assassin, and Flyer gear. So, pros and cons, right? 2 range versus 1 range, and so on. Alright, so after the best class, let's talk about her skill combos. And the most common one, especially for PvE, is what I have right now. You have Discipline for 2 range attack skill that allows melee soldiers to attack. You have Redemption for the exact same thing, and then you have Faith to increase the damage of each attack and allow you to restore hit points to the friendly unit with the lowest health. So this is the most common skill combo of Chris. Right? You may, for PvP content, you may change that up. You will probably throw in Dispel and then maybe Mass Attack, depending on how you set up, depending on basically the scenario. In terms of the Redemption skill, I think it's actually a terrible skill because it has self range and only a span of 2 blocks. So that basically means you have to move yourself next to the enemy to hit them with the Redemption skill. It is powerful in that it can dispel 2 buffs from the enemy, but getting into melee range with Chris is pretty difficult. So generally speaking, I'm not a fan of this skill. Alright, so pretty much this is the standard skill combo for Chris. You may throw in Dispel and Mass Attack, depending on the scenario, for PvP. So, with that said, let's talk about her soldiers. And in terms of the hero boost for soldiers, because she is an SR, she only gets a 25% stat boost for heroes to start, rather than the 30% that SSRs tend to have. It starts off with a 10% defense increase and a 15% magic defense increase. Her third bond also boosts defense and magic defense. So the final bond is what you see here. 10% for hit points, 10% for attack, 35% for defense, and 40% for magic defense. this soldier boost very much is a PvE oriented soldier boost because there's no real hit point increase, right? Meaning her soldiers are very easy to kill in general. And the lack of attack value means her soldiers are lacking a lot of attack compared to heroes like, let's say, Lana, whose soldiers get 40% attack increase. However, there are some things to keep in mind. First is that the Faith's effect increases damage by 15%, and then her talent also increases damage by another 20%, so there is that additional 35% damage increase. But it really does not make up for the low attack stat in general. Despite that, however, she has access to a very good selection of soldiers. From her training ground, she gets Zealots, and keep in mind, at level 10, Zealots can buff attack, defense, and magic defense by 45%. She gets Highland Warriors, who have an attack increase, and it's a slight attack increase and a slight damage increase. And her third and final soldier from training grounds is the Amazon Champion, who get a pretty good attack increase, and a chance to reduce enemies' defense by 20%. So, 3 very useful soldiers. From her classes, she gets Exorcist, who is generally, in my opinion, worse than Zealots, and Heavy Infantry. And she finally gets from the Princess class, Bishop and High Elf. Generally speaking, since Chris is used as Valkyrie, her best soldiers is actually very situational, depending on what you attack, right? General purpose wise, it's definitely Zealots because of the 45% stat increase. However, if you end up fighting a lot of cavalry enemies, you may decide to bring Amazon Champions as her soldiers rather than Zealots. And then if you're fighting a lot of Lancer class enemies with Chris, you may choose to bring Highland Warrior or Heavy Infantry, depending on which one you have leveled up. So, I would say her best 3 soldiers as Valkyrie would be Zealots, Heavy Infantry, and Amazon Champions, if you have them all leveled up. Otherwise, you can just stick with Zealots in general. And if you were using her as a Princess class, well, you'd probably use High Elf because of the additional attack and defense when in woods and terrain. Additional healing from the bishops is nice, but if you're using a PvP-oriented Princess, Chris, you probably don't need her to be doing healing because she'll probably be using Dispel and Mass Attack, and she won't really be attacking with these redemption kind of skills in general. Alright, so with the soldiers covered, let's now talk about her gear. And before I talk about her gear though, I should mention this first. For PvE, okay, because she is paired with Ledin, who guards against both melee and magic attacks, in very many ways, she never gets actually attacked. And that means she actually doesn't really need armor or helmets at the SSR level, at least for PvE content. For example, when I cleared Scylla level 65 with a Legion of Glory party, I was using a 4-star Chris, and her power was only 4579, which is very low for a level 65 battle, in truth. And looking at her gear, you can see she just has a Gift of Eternal Life at level 50, a True Cross at level 50, but her armor and helmets were both SR items. And in fact, her armor was a level 30 Devout Coat, while her helm was a level 50 Sage's Hat. Enchant was Tree of Life, which doesn't really buff her attack value at all. It just buffs allies. And this was enough to allow Chris to clear the fight. And it worked in large part because when she attacks, all the damage was basically absorbed by her soldiers, right? With not that much damage going through to her. Because the Zealots, having plus 45% stats, they absorbed almost all the damage. And so whatever damage does go through her, to her, would be healed when she uses the Redemption or Discipline skill, and then has the Faith healing, as well as the Gift of Eternal Life heal effect. So that's what really kept Chris healthy and in the battle. And of course, there was also Lana as my primary healer, who would also heal via her talent and her skill, right? So that was enough to keep Chris healthy, even with 2 SR items and level 30 armor, in fact. So that's something to keep in mind. You just need a level 50 Gift of Eternal Life, and then a level 50 SR item that provides intelligence increase, whether it is a True Cross, or a Holy Ring, or whatever. As long as it's level 51, it will work out. However, if we're talking about optimal gear, I would say her optimal gear would be, once again, Gift of Eternal Life. For her armor, you would probably choose either Tenyos Robe for the 10% hit point increase, or else a Last Rites, because as long as your character is at 100%, all damage taken is reduced by 40%. And keep in mind, Last Rites can only be equipped on the Valkyrie Chris. In terms of her helmet, tons of choices here. Generally speaking, for PvE, all you just need is a Sage's Hat to apply the Sage's Hat buff onto Ledin, right? But if you're talking about PvE, or sorry, if you're talking about PvP, then you have a wide variety of choices, right? In PvP, your tank will probably have Overlord's Badge, giving them immunity to speed decrease effects. Thus, the Sage's Hat buff is much less important, which means you can choose, let's say, King's Crown to increase the damage of an ally by 20%. You can choose Tenyos Headdress for a random buff on an ally, in addition to the random buffs she provides via her talent. You can choose to give her Charon, because Charon has a chance to apply all damage received increased by 15% for one enemy within 3 blocks. So once she gets fairly close to the enemy, she can start debuffing them. You can choose to give her Soul Stealer Headdress, which effectively has the same thing, same effect as Charon, right? After taking action, you have a chance to silence the active skills of one enemy within 3 blocks. And finally, I would say the last item would be the standard Yggdrasil Reef, which is just a flat upgrade on the Sage's Hat, right? Just more stats and a 10% hit point buff, which the Sage's Hat does not provide. So that's 5 different helms that she can use. In fact, technically, she could even use a Jormungandr's Eye, but I'm personally not a huge fan of the Jormungandr's Eye. The debuff effect of decreasing damage by 15% for one enemy is not that great, and it only applies on enemies within 2 blocks, as opposed to these ones which apply on an enemy within 3 blocks. So, yeah. So, that's 3 pieces of gear, and then the last piece of gear, well, the most common and the best in slot for her is generally considered to be an item that I currently don't have, and that is Dimensional Jewel. First, it increases hit points and int, which is the best stat buff, and second, it does provide an 8% int increase, and most importantly, when attacking with a skill, you have I think it was a 50% chance to reduce cooldown by 1. This is very important for Chris because she only has 2 attack skills. And while one of the attack skills has a 1-turn cooldown, the other one has the 2-turn cooldown. So generally speaking, what ends up happening is you throw out Discipline, you throw out Redemption, you can throw out Discipline again, then you have a 1-turn cooldown where you can't use either skill. With Dimensional Jewel, generally speaking, as long as it activates 1 time within the first 3 turns, you can continue to endlessly toss out these skills, right? Discipline and Redemption. So that's why Dimensional Jewel is considered her best in slot gear. However, that is only for PvE content. For PvP, with the dangers of being silenced everywhere, you may consider giving her, let's say, the Holy Ring, because of the immunity to silence effect. It all depends, because if you have multiple healers, the other healers may be able to remove the debuffs on Chris, allowing her to continue to attack with her skills and whatnot. So, kind of up to you. And also, in PvP, you may end up using her other skills like Mass Attack and Dispel. And the thing about Mass Attack is, it does grant immunity to effects that silence active skills. So if you have Mass Attack on her, she will not need a Holy Ring. So, something to keep in mind. Alright, so with her gear covered, let's finally talk about her enchants. And enchant-wise, for PvE, especially in the early game stages where you don't have strong enchants, the best enchant for her is probably Tree of Life. Right? Because that will increase the defense and magic defense of all heroes within 2 blocks by 5%. So, since she's generally walking beside Ledin, if you're using her, she can always provide the Tree of Life buff to Ledin, strengthening him, and also provide Sage's Hat to Ledin, so that he can tank hits without getting slowed or whatever. So that's why Ledin and Chris is an amazing combo for PvE in early game, especially with the Tree of Life enchant, giving Ledin more stats. However, once your enchants and your Ledin reaches higher star levels, he becomes really, really powerful, to the point where, he has enough stats that he doesn't need the Tree of Life additional stats anymore. And when that happens, you probably do want to change his enchants away from Tree of Life to something like Breeze. The reason for Breeze is because Chris lacks mobility with her mere 3 movement. Having the Breeze activation, increasing her movement to 5 can really help, especially for PvP. And it also helps in the sense that Breeze does increase damage dealt by 10%. Now, I should mention, however, that for PvP, ultimately Chris is not a top tier hero at all. And a part of this is because of her lack of mobility in range. Having 3 movement and only skills that can attack at 2 range means she has an effective attack range of 5 blocks in general. Characters like, let's say, Lana even though she has no movement buffs, she has an effective attack range of, let's say, 7 blocks because of Black Hole, right? Black Hole having 3 range, getting 1 range increase means she has a 4 block range and she can move 3, which means 7 block attack range for the first strike, and then afterwards she can attack at 2 range or 3 range, right? So that's one big difference. Chris has basically no way to initiate combat and get close because she only has 5 attack range, ultimately. So, in that sense, Chris's use in PvP is really primarily support, right? Mass Attack to buff up stats, Dispel to dispel debuffs, and then maybe throw out the occasional attack with, let's say, with probably the Discipline skill, because it has a 1-turn cooldown. And the other thing about Chris in PvP would be her talent, right? The fact that she can give 4 random buffs to allies, 1 each of course, can really help. If you get, let's say, a +3 mobility buff on one of your allies, that can allow them to attack when they normally couldn't. However, it is worth mentioning as well that for mobility buffs, heroes like Leticia or Matthew, who have the sprint skill, are generally better for a guaranteed mobility buff, right? And in the case of Leticia, she actually gives +2 movement due to love support plus sprint. And in the case of random buff effects, honestly speaking, Anna can do the same thing, and she's a dedicated healer. Because Anna, when casting a skill on a friendly unit, this skill grants 1 extra random buff to the allies. So skills that you cast on allies would be things like Dispel, right? Or Mass Resist, or Mass Protect. casting those skills on would instantly cause them to get a random buff. So that does mean Chris has less and less, has a very minor role, generally speaking, in PvP. But I just thought I would mention, if you were going to use it for PvP, this would be it. And it would really only work for Season 1. After Season 1, she would be completely obsolete in Apex Arena. And with all that said, I think that pretty much concludes this video. So overall, I would say Chris is a very useful character for PvE and very much a mediocre character for PvP. You know, very usable in Season 1 when people don't have that many characters ready and set up for it, but by Season 2 and Season 3, she definitely should be dropped from your PvP team. Alright, so thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you found this video useful, and on that note, Nitro out.